Anyway, it's really nice for me to be able to start this event, but really, Francisco has made this event happen. I'll let him introduce his friends, his colleagues who are here to comment. And this product here is Francisco's work and the work of Francisco's organization. So I'm really happy that iCross could help co-sponsor this event. But really, Francisco, this today is for you. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Francisco, for bringing all these great people here.
Thanks very much, Aaron, and thanks to all of you for being here, and everybody also who's joining us virtually. And I'm going to give the floor to Paula Ramon, who's going to kick off.
Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Paula Ramon. I'm a journalist and an author of a book about Venezuela called Motherland. So I'm going to introduce the main star of the day, Francisco Rodríguez. Francisco Rodríguez is the Rice Family Professor of the Practice of International and Public Affairs at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. He's also the founder and director of All for Venezuela, a non-profit organization focusing on finding solutions to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. He also holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Rodríguez has taught economics and Latin American studies in the US and in Venezuela. He has held prominent positions in the public and private sector, international organizations, including head of research of the United Nations Human Development Report Office. Francisco Rodríguez has also published more than 50 research papers in academic outlets, including the American Economic Journal, Journal of Economic Growth, among others. And his book, Scorched Earth, The Political Economy of Venezuela's Collapse, will be published in 2024. I will introduce Willie Newman as well. William Newman is an author and journalist who reported for the New York Times for over 15 years. He served as the New York Times Andes Region Bureau Chief between 2012 and 2016, while he was based in Caracas, Venezuela by then. His excellent book, Things Are Never So Bad That They Can Get Worse, Inside the Collapse of Venezuela, just received the Cornelius Ryan Award of the Overseas Press Club of America as the best nonfiction book of international affairs of 2022. A Spanish edition was recently published in Venezuela. And his work has also appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, The New York Post, and San Francisco Chronicle, among others. He started his journalist career while living in Mexico and has also published English translations of several Spanish language novels. David Smile, last but not least, is the Charles A. and Leo M. Favre Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University. He's also a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, where he founded the Venezuela Politics and Human Rights blog, which he curated from 2012 to 2020. He has lived in or worked on Venezuela since 1992, and he has researched Venezuela for the past 30 years. He has taught at the Universidad Central de Venezuela and Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas. And he's currently working on a book manuscript called Venezuela's Transition to Liberalism, Hugo Chavez and 21st Century Socialism, 2007-2012. So, Francisco, please.
Well, thank you very much, Paula. Thanks to all of you for coming here. And today is actually the first event of a Venezuela double header that we have. And tomorrow at 5 p.m., we'll be having our three guests, Paula, Willie, and David, talk about their books. They're the authors of three recent books on Venezuela, which I very much encourage you to read. And they're all three of them are great reads. And today we're going to be talking about work that I have been doing from the Oil for Venezuela Foundation. So first of all, let me tell you a bit about Oil for Venezuela. We created Oil for Venezuela in 2019. And the idea of the organization was to put together efforts of research and advocacy towards thinking about solutions to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. Now, Venezuela is a country that has experienced the deepest economic collapse documented anywhere in the world outside of wartime. It's a place where the per capita income has fallen by 72%. More than 1/5 of the population has left the country. Poverty rates have skyrocketed, malnutrition rates have skyrocketed. And what we wanted to do here is think about these problems from a different perspective than the one that we felt a lot of people were using to think about them. So if you look at a lot of the writing on Venezuela, a lot of it coming out of Washington organizations or universities, some of it also coming from Venezuela scholars, a lot of it seemed to be focused on what is to be done on the day after. And what was the day after? The day after was the day after change, the day after political change, the day after regime change. So the idea is that there's a political crisis in Venezuela, and that political crisis has to be resolved. And before we talk about anything else, and that through the perspective of many people who took this approach was, well, the first thing that has to happen is that Maduro has to leave, and we cannot, Maduro is the current president of Venezuela, and we cannot talk about any type of initiative to solve people's problems unless we solve that precondition, because nothing can be addressed unless there is a change in the people who are in government. Of course, when you spoke to the people who were in government or their sympathizers, which are also an important part of Venezuela, an important fraction of the population, they would actually say the same exact thing, but the other way around, which is, well, nothing will be solved. We won't be able to address the problems until the opposition stops hounding us and lets us govern. And our idea was that it is important, of course, to think about what can be done once the political crisis is solved. And I think that there's a lot of valuable work that came out of thinking about the day after. But this work wasn't speaking to the needs of Venezuelans. Venezuelans are living through a political, economic, and humanitarian crisis that implies real urgent problems that people are living through in the day-to-day. And that if the only answer to those problems is, well, let's wait until the political crisis is resolved, let's wait until we get political change, that doesn't speak to the urgent needs of people. So our idea was, why don't we start thinking about what can be done now and how we can make progress now in terms of addressing people's real problems. And that means actually accepting current conditions, including the current political crisis, as something that you have to engage with and that you have to think through. How is it that you can create initiatives that actually help address people's problems, given that there is a political crisis? And this political crisis implies, and it has implied in Venezuela, that different sides of the political spectrum and different sides of the political conflict actually have control over significant levers of what needs to be done. So if you look at the Venezuelan problem and you try to think through the policies that a government would need to adopt, many of the policy levers that you would have to pull are not under the complete control either of the government that holds de facto power, which is the government of Nicolas Maduro, or of the Venezuelan opposition. Venezuela's main export industry, as many of you know, is oil. More than 90% of its revenues come out of the export of oil. But it turns out that there's one government that controls the production of oil. But there's another government that is the only one that is legally entitled to sell Venezuelan oil in the US, which up until recently was the government headed by former legislator Juan Guaido. So within this context, what we started thinking about was, well, where and how can you search for spaces of cooperation where these groups, but not necessarily only these groups, where you can have different voices and different sectors from civil society, from society at large, start thinking about cooperating and getting one step beyond conflict and addressing the problems that people need addressed. And that means, and that implies, and that's what's reflected in our work, thinking directly about how to improve living conditions for Venezuelans, thinking about how you can identify common goals and objectives among these groups, and also thinking about how you can overcome this game of zero-sum politics where you have two sides that are fighting over power and that cannot seem to agree on anything because they're their fight is for both of them, essentially existential, but existential about control of the state. So what we've done in this book is that we've looked at different areas in which you can reach consensus, you can reach agreements, and what we've tried to do is not only emphasize our own thinking and our own proposals. So Oil for Venezuela has been around since 2019, and we've been writing about these issues and putting forward proposals. But there are other groups and other scholars who have also done it. So, for example, the Boston group has put forward proposals. The Boston group is a group actually primarily Venezuelans, despite its name, that includes representatives from the government and the opposition. So they've put forward proposals. The Atlantic Council has put forward proposals. So what we tried to do here was also have a compendium. And by the way, you're free to help yourself to copies of these books that we have here. A compendium of thinking about addressing these problems from a cooperative standpoint, from a cooperative approach. Now, you might know that on October 17th, there was an announcement by the Unitary Platform and the Maduro government that they were resuming conversations, that they were resuming negotiations, and in fact, they signed 2 agreements. One of them is very focused on the election and political rights and electoral guarantees. Another one has to do with the protection of the vital interests of the nation, which is essentially focused on protecting assets, one of the themes that we touched in our book. And there have been other agreements that have been signed in the past, including an agreement that is focused on addressing social problems. But these agreements, there has been little implementation of these agreements, and particularly of the social agreement and on the agreement on protecting the vital interests. And you may also have heard that there are a lot of things going on in Venezuela in the past few days where both sides are effectively claiming that the other side has violated the agreement, so that it may be that this effort of negotiations that just took some life recently, it may be that this does not subsist over time. It may be that it does. But what we do know happened is that the United States significantly eased sanctions on Venezuela and is, in principle, at least on paper, accepting Venezuelan exports of oil. Now, there's still no new oil that has come into the US under this mechanism. It's a mechanism, not only was it just announced 2 weeks ago, but it's actually a mechanism that it's not clear how to implement it, because it's still the case, as I mentioned previously, that the legal representation and therefore the capacity to sell oil, Venezuelan oil in the US, is actually a capacity that is still held by the country's opposition, not by the Maduro government. So there's no easy, simple legal mechanism whereby the country's oil production can actually be brought to the US and delivered and sold, even though these licenses exist. And these licenses were announced recently. But this still brings forward the type of question that we wanted to focus a discussion on is the following. There will be, if this new regime of easing of sanctions effectively goes into operation, and all of these issues around the legal representation and invoicing and how does the PDVSA controlled by Maduro sell this, in the US, despite the fact that there is a PDVSA board appointed by the opposition that controls PDVSA in the US. Even if we get through all of these problems, or if we get through all of these issues, there's going to be a considerable stream of revenue, of additional revenue that's going to be generated and that's going to go into Venezuela. So how do we think about ways to ensure that those funds actually go towards addressing the needs of Venezuelans? How do we think about mechanisms that ensure that they're not deviated to corruption, they're not deviated towards non-essential purposes? And how can we think of mechanisms where actually society participates in the decision as to what is done with these funds? Well, here again is where the thinking that we've been carrying out is relevant, even though at the moment in which we wrote and we published the book, we didn't know that negotiations were going to resume, and much less did we know, because this came as somewhat of a surprise to many analysts, that the U.S. would engage in such in what is, in paper at least, a major easing of oil sanctions. But this really makes relevant the question of what is it that's going to get done with that money, and how do we ensure that that money actually goes to address the needs of Venezuelans? So now I wanted to show you some graphs from the book, and these graphs are illustrative of some of the main issues that we deal with. Now, the first one is a graph that represents both the evolution of real per capita GDP, which is an indicator of living standards. And as you can see, there's a huge drop there. That's that 72% drop, which occurs between the peak, which is 2012 and 2013, and the lowest moment, which is 2020. But what you also see in the white line there is the evolution of oil exports, of real per capita oil exports. And you also see a huge drop. So this essentially is the basic reality of the Venezuelan economy, is that this is an economy that its only source of income, its only relevant source of income from the rest of the world was oil exports. So once oil exports started declining, then it was very difficult for the economy not to enter into a tailspin. Now, why did oil exports decline? There's a long discussion there. And in fact, the decline in oil exports began well before sanctions, but a lot of that initial decline has to do with a drop in oil prices. Afterwards, from 2017 on, when oil prices start recovering, it continues to decline, and a great part of the explanation for that actually does have to do with sanctions. Now, you see on the right-hand side, the evolution of malnutrition in Venezuela, undernourishment. And this is actually quite a striking graph, because if you look at the middle part, the one that has these little yellow lines, that is the period during which Venezuela reduced its undernourishment rate to less than 2.5% of the population. And the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN actually, once you reach below 2.5%, it doesn't make an attempt to measure how low it is. It considers that that's essentially the standard of a developed country. So what we see is that there was a lot of progress towards diminishing undernourishment, even when it got, according to these statistics, it got to be to the level of a developed country. And then we see a major increase occur in this period where GDP is declining, where oil exports are declining. Now, on the left-hand side here, you see the evolution of oil production. I won't go through the whole graph, but there's been, of course, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of research, not just based on this graph and others. And the research, it comes up pretty decisively on the side of indicating that there has been a significant effect of oil sanctions on the country's oil production. That does not mean that it's the only driver of the decline in oil production. That does not mean that it's the only driver of the decline in oil revenues, and much less of the economic collapse of Venezuela, but it does have a significant impact. And on the right-hand side there, what you see is the evolution of food imports. So we were just looking at undernourishment. Now, in a country whose economy is essentially built to export oil to the rest of the world, and that's how it's worked for the past 100 years, and to use the proceeds from that oil to import things to keep the economy running, including import the things that people in the country consume and use for their basic consumption, then if you have a collapse in oil exports and you have a collapse in import capacity, then you're going to have a collapse in food imports. And this is going to be a significant driver of the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing. So the book has a discussion of different types of initiatives that could be used to address these problems. One of them are oil for essentials agreements. I'm not going to go into the details of all of the different types of oil for essentials agreements, but just to say that there are different versions, there are different proposals, and a lot of them have to do, and a lot of the main differences have to do with how we treat the governance of the use of these revenues. So there are some people who view it as, and that would be our position from Oil for Venezuela, as we should take this as an opportunity to create institutions that are locally owned with local actors that monitor and create transparency around the use of these revenues. There are other approaches which say, no, the political conflict is too intractable, and therefore we need to bring in an external agency like, say, the United Nations to completely administer these funds. This is a table which, again, I won't go through it, but the presentation, as well as the book, the presentation is on our website if you want to look at it. And basically what this tells you is that there is that there are huge gains if we could, from the easing of sanctions, if this easing of sanctions actually, okay, so I guess this pointer doesn't work for this type of screen. I'm just discovering that. Okay, yeah, okay. Well, anyway, so what I was going to point out is that one of the numbers that you have there, which is $15 billion, it's the one that's on the first row near the top in the first kind of yellow highlighted row, is the current revenues, the current export revenues. Depending on the different scenarios, these export revenues could go up to $35 billion with an easing of sanctions. So we're effectively talking about a more than doubling of export revenue. And that is a substantial amount of resources, and we should be having a discussion, regardless of whether it's using our proposals or proposals of others, or just basically a public discussion about what is going to get done with this money. And it's actually quite remarkable that a discussion that has been somewhat absent in Venezuela over the past couple of weeks since this easing was announced. The other point, and I want to make 2 points before I close. One of them is that in Venezuela, there has been a substantial effort to increase food assistance over the course of the past several years. And what you see on the left-hand side here is the increase in the food-related government program beneficiaries since 2021. And what you see is that this has increased significantly through a program known as the Local Committees of Supply and Production. Now, this program, which is essentially a program of delivery of very low-cost food boxes to families, it has received a lot of criticism because of the quality of the food, because of the insufficiency of the amount of food, and the fact that very few families appear to receive it with any type of regular distribution, much less the regular distribution that you would need in order to depend on it. So there's definitely a lot to criticize of this program, but one of the points that we emphasize is that it's worth studying the program, understanding in what sense this program has helped avert a broader food crisis in Venezuela. What's wrong with this program, among other things, the fact that the whole structure that administers it is very closely linked with a political structure, is very closely politicized, and to think about ways in which these social policies can be reformed so that they can be more effective and that they can also not be manipulated or used by the sides to the political conflict. So in closing, and part of what we explain in the final chapter is that once you start thinking about a cooperative approach to solving the country's problems, you also have to start thinking, should be thinking about whether this implies a different design of negotiations. So what we would emphasize is that if you look at negotiations initiatives in Venezuela, the negotiation that was just announced in Barbados is the 8th round of negotiations that has been announced between the government and the opposition in Venezuela since Nicolas Maduro came to power. There were also 3 others which were done during Chavez's time in office, and all of these have ended up pretty much in the same place, which is nowhere. And we believe that this should invite us to rethink about the structure of these negotiations, to think about how they can be redesigned. And particularly among the suggestions that we propose for discussion is the possibility of making these negotiations broader, of including more groups, and not just groups from the political spectrum, but groups from civil society, non-governmental organizations, including other voices, which is a model that was used successfully in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, and it's one of the ways in which multi-stakeholder negotiations actually allow you and help you move out of zero-sum politics, because then you get other groups and other people who represent important sectors of Venezuelan society saying, well, yes, there's the political crisis and there's the struggle for power, but there are also problems of people in this country that we want to solve. So again, well, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you, and very much looking forward to your comments.
Thanks, Francisco. So I'm going to open for William and David to do some comments and start like the questions. And then after that, we are going to open for you to take a chance to do some questions. So who wants to start?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for coming here. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's great to see this interest. It's great to be with my friend Francisco again, and see Aaron and the familiar faces here, and Willie. First I would just like to comment on, just an opening comment on what this book means. I've been sort of involved in this or commenting on this conflict from the beginning. Really, I was in Venezuela when Chavez was elected and followed this the whole time, and quite closely. And this book is really, first of all, it's just a really extraordinary history of the conflict. And I got this, and I thought I was going to skim through it because I had, it was kind of overall and what the argument is, but I ended up reading the whole thing, and just because I just kept reading, it was like, oh yeah, that after that came after that, and that was related in this way. And so I think that's just a first thing, that just to say a word of appreciation from a fellow Venezuela watcher, that I think you guys did just an amazing job with this. And I know how difficult it can be to write a history like this. When you read it, it seems simple, but to get all these facts together, and these are complex facts, complex facts about economic issues in which there's not good data on oftentimes, and facts that are contested because of a process of political polarization, and how they're related is contested. So this is not an easy task. So just to give you one example, I think, of what this book does that has been elusive for the past several years is this point about how do you explain Venezuela's economic collapse. If you check into what many of us call, without great affection, Venezuela Twitter, or Twitterzuela, you will see that the debate usually goes like this. People that are allied with the government or allies of the government will point to the sanctions. That is what's causing Venezuela's crisis. And then people with the opposition will say, no, actually the crisis began before the sanctions. It'll just go round and round. It's been doing that for years, round and round. Very frustrating. If you have any training in social sciences, you know that multi-causality is not at all controversial. And secondly, first cause or original cause does not necessarily mean it's the most important cause. And so what this book does is it shows that there's actually two crises in one. It shows the crises that came from sort of the natural sort of attrition of the populist model, or the decline of a populist economic model. And then, also looks and very clearly documents the impact of U.S. economic sanctions, and distills out what that impact is. This is just, I think, a huge contribution. I think the book has done an immense service in digesting the facts and presenting them in a way that not everyone's going to agree with, but it's a clear narrative that's clear enough to generate discussion. People are actually going to be talking about the same thing. And so I think this book is really going to advance the debate and be very useful to all of those who are advocating in and around negotiations in Venezuela. So I'm just going to start with, I have several questions, but I'm just going to start with one, and then we'll just kind of see how much time we have for Willie's and I question and yours. So my first sort of comment question is with the argument in the last chapter, that really provides the focus or the reason for the whole book. And that is this is the chapter on negotiation. And that's where you point out, that's where Francisco and co-authors point out the number of failed negotiation processes there have been, suggest that this is because there's a zero-sum element to the Venezuelan Constitution, that greatly rewards having power and punishes those who do not have power. So in other words, the stakes are just very, very high. And so, and this is what explains the conflict. Yeah. So I think the book sort of presents this as something uniquely Venezuelan, and this helps us understand why the negotiations have failed. When I read this, and this is what I've thought for quite a while, is that I think that it's actually a pretty typical conflict, that conflict happens, long-term conflict happens because of these structural problems when, there's incompatible interests, and because the fear of losing the battle is great. These are the reasons that conflict happened. It's happened in Venezuela, South Africa, back in the 1980s. The white population had very good reason to believe that they would be in jeopardy if governed by the Black South Africans. In Poland, the communists knew that they had everything to lose if they were pushed out of power at the end of the 1980s. As well, General Pinochet in Chile, imagine the stakes there. He knew better than anybody the blood of thousands he had on his hands, yet negotiations happened. And they generally happen through the mechanisms that are being implemented in Venezuela. The idea is to sort of build trust and confidence by first working on the low-hanging fruit. In Venezuela, this has been the humanitarian accord that was agreed on last November, or almost a year ago, as well as the protecting the Essequibo region in the dispute with Guyana. This is something that virtually every Venezuelan agrees on, and so it's low-hanging fruit. In fact, the Norwegian mediated Venezuela negotiation. There's a memorandum of understanding that was signed in August 2021 that they worked very hard on getting the two sides to have this common agenda and common sort of micro narrative, but it was an achievement. They're very proud of it, and they're sticking with that memorandum of understanding that hits a lot of these points, including the economic ones, but I think even more important, and it has the issues of justice. There are grave issues of accusations of crimes against humanity against the Maduro government. There's all kinds of other kinds of indictments for drugs and human rights abuses, and so I should say that I think and also the memorandum of understanding also has it calls for a mechanism for the consultation of civil society, and I know at WOLA we've been facilitating that. A number of our partner organizations have been working on that. So the question is, what do you think about, Francisco, what do you think about the negotiation process that started in August 2021 and this memorandum of understanding? Do you think that it covers the main issues? Do you think others should be hit upon or in a different order? Or just, I guess more broadly, what do you think should be done differently? Let me just point out that, excuse me, during the Chavez period, actually, there was a negotiation that was successful. The 2003-2004 negotiation, called for a recall referendum that actually was held, and that actually, for a time being, resolved the really acute conflict. Of course, it's often seen as a failure because the opposition kind of lost out. We went to recall referendum and Chavez beat it handily. And so that's often considered, and often, in the literature, oftentimes people will call that a case of appeasement. But actually it was a negotiation and both sides signed off and things sort of evolved. One side ended up losing out, and so they see it as a failure. But that was actually a successful negotiation. It's important to remember that, because that's probably what will happen this time too. At a certain point, one side will feel like they ended up losing out. But let me just throw it back to you then, if you could see what you think should be different.
Great, wonderful. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for your comments on the volume, on the book, and how you think that the book helps to strengthen discussion around Venezuela. Now, with regards to your question, I would start out from talking about those same three cases that you mentioned, which are South Africa, Poland, and Chile. And in all of those cases, there was an agreement to create a transitional national unity government. And that was key in the sense that what occurred in all of them was an agreement around coexistence. And it was an agreement that whoever prevailed in the political conflict was not going to use that power to persecute those who did not prevail. Actually, one of the most striking images that I've seen coming out of these negotiation processes actually is an image of Lech Walesa in 2011 visiting General Jaruzelski when he was ill with cancer in the hospital, and saying to him, well, get well, General. And Walesa was jailed by Jaruzelski, so he was a political prisoner. Walesa at one time was the Leopoldo Lopez of Poland. So, well, if you can imagine Leopoldo Lopez like 30 years from now, going to Diosdado Cabello, visiting him in the hospital and saying, get well, Commander, I don't know what it is that you call Diosdado. That seems completely unimaginable. Now, I tend to think that that is as unimaginable and as it would have sounded in the 1980s if you told people from Solidarity that 30 years after that you would have an event like that. And what I think that the roundtable agreements were able to do in Poland was that they were able to set the basis for coexistence. They were able to set essentially an agreement as to how to move forward with the reframing of the nation, in which there was going to be political competition. That political competition would be limited at the start. There would be a national unity government. Part of the relationship and the good relationship that emerged between Walesa and Jaruzelski has to do with the fact that they actually governed the country together through a coalition government. And the same can be said. That's the reason why de Klerk was the vice president of Mandela. There was an agreement around coexistence. And I think that actually, if you compare, one comparison that I think is really interesting is that between South Africa, where you did have that agreement on coexistence, and then you built the grounds for an electoral solution, but an electoral solution that was based not on the idea that elections resolve everything, but that elections are one mechanism of a democracy, and that democracy also implies the protection of the limits on state power and the protections of the political rights of minorities. And that's why we have in South Africa an inclusive society where, yes, the Blacks dominate political power, but it's different from a place where you didn't have this process, where the process was resolved through an armed conflict, which was Zimbabwe. And in that armed conflict, where one group prevailed, what we've seen over the course of the past 40 years is essentially attempts to, in a sustained way, take away property, take away rights, take away everything from the group that lost. So my problem with the approach, and I don't consider 2003 a success. And I don't consider 2003 a success for one simple reason, which is that you had an election, and the election was won by one of the sides, in that case by Chavez, and the opposition did not accept the results of that election. The opposition claimed, without much basis, that the results of those elections had been fraudulent. And in fact, not only did they disavow the results of that election, but in 2005, the opposition boycotted the elections, the parliamentary elections that occurred. So I don't think that it resolved the conflict. I actually think that it maintained the conflict. Now, there's something else that happened in Venezuela, which was that oil prices then shot up to $100 a barrel. Chavez became very popular. He was able to prevail electorally during some time. So the political game, because of changes in economic conditions, evolved. So when I look at the Memorandum of Understanding 2001, what are the things that I think are objectionable about that? Well, first of all, the parties. So you have the unitary platform. The unitary platform, essentially, its mandate comes out of a legislative election that was held in 2015, where even those parties that are actually represented, if you count the legislators that they have in an election that took place, well, at that time it had been 6 years ago, now it's 8 years ago, they don't even have a majority in that 2015 assembly. But it's also a group that I believe had huge levels of legitimacy when they were elected and maintained it over some time. And I think that legitimacy has been eroded. And in fact, in the opposition primaries, we saw a consequence of that, which is that a group that did not consider and was not considered, and the candidate coming from a group that was not considered part of the unitary platform was actually the one that swept the primaries. But I think I mean I would put the emphasis on the fact that there is a problem of representation. I think that the sides that were negotiating did not have the legitimacy to present a proposal for anything to the Venezuelan population. And that also applies to Maduro. I think that applies to both of them. Now, another problem that I have with it is that when you look at one of the basic principles, it's the principle of nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed on. Now, of course, they state the principle and then they say there are exceptions and you can have partial agreements. But I actually think that that principle is very problematic. I mean, because that principle essentially suggests that in order to reach agreement on issues like how to address the humanitarian crisis and how to address the economic crisis, you have to be thinking in terms of a global agreement. And I actually think it should be the other way around. I think that we should have discussions with multiple stakeholders as to how do we solve concrete problems of Venezuelans. And if that is able to lead to a political agreement, that's great. But if it's not able to lead to a political agreement, but it allows attending and addressing the humanitarian crisis and the economic crisis, then that will have significantly improved the lives of Venezuelans. I don't see that either in the text of the Memorandum of Understanding, nor in the approach. I mean, when I look at the current negotiations in Barbados, this actually, it seems to be, one of the problems about living in Venezuela, about studying Venezuela, is that it's like permanent Groundhog Day. You know, it's like the 20th sequel of Groundhog Day. And I look at this, and this just looks to me exactly like what they were discussing in the Media Hotel back in 2002, 2003, which is, how do we solve this through an election? And this is, once you understand that this is a situation of conflict, then thinking that it can be resolved just through an election, I mean, that's basically like coming into a war zone and saying, oh, we're going to resolve this conflict by setting out a clear set of rules by which you can shoot each other. No, when you try to resolve a conflict situation, you try to reach an agreement around coexistence. And I think that what I would like to see in these negotiations is that we address the issues of coexistence before the issue of how do we decide who holds on to power.
Hello. First, I want to say thank you to Francisco and the Corbell School for inviting me here. And I'm very excited to be here, actually, because for several reasons. I've covered Venezuela since 2012 when I went there to be the correspondent for the New York Times. And one of the first people, or very early on when I was there, I called Francisco. And I guess we must have talked on the phone, and then I was up in New York and I met you in your office in the Bank of America. And it became clear to me instantly, I think, that here was somebody who had a really deep understanding of what was going on in Venezuela and was intensely smart and much smarter than I was, and willing to share what he knew. And he was very accessible, and he was able to share his knowledge in a very clear way. And he was able to talk and explain complex issues in very clear terms, in terms that somebody who didn't have necessarily, he's an economist and I'm a journalist, in terms that I was able to understand. And that helped me a lot in to digest a lot of these things and then go on to explain them to readers of the Times as I went on to write about Venezuela until today. And the book I read about Venezuela came out last year, I guess. And I talked to Francisco when I was working on it. But also, I'm not a very organized person, but I kept all my notebooks and all the recordings of all the interviews I did in the entire time from the beginning of working on Venezuela. And so I went back because there was one conversation that we had, I don't even remember what year, maybe 2014. And I had it on tape, and I went back and I took a lot of stuff from that. I forget whether the quotes from that are in the book or just some of the concepts are in the book. So I'm very excited to be here. And David is another person who, when I got to Venezuela, he was there, and we had conversations early on, and he helped me sort of get my feet on the ground there. And Paula is somebody who I worked with several times. And Paula and I over the years have had many long conversations about the craziness of both what's going on in Venezuela and also working in Venezuela as a journalist. So it's very exciting and an honor for me to be here with everybody. I'm very excited about Francisco's new book, and I echo everything that David said about it. I was last week, I just happened to meet with a friend of mine, Jorge Castañeda, who's the former foreign minister of Mexico. And we had a disagreement about something related to we were talking about Venezuela, and a question about when the massive out-migration of Venezuelans began. And so after a couple of days later, I was reading Francisco's book before coming here, and I read the whole section on migration. I took pictures of those pages and I sent them to Jorge. So it's a very useful book. But I was just in Venezuela maybe 2 weeks ago. And I happened to be there when this Barbados announcement happened. And as Francisco explained, the two sides, the opposition and the government, went to Barbados to sign an agreement that has parameters for possibly improving the guarantees or conditions of a presidential election that will happen in Venezuela next year. And more or less simultaneously, the United States announced that it was easing in a significant way some of the sanctions on Venezuela, in particular, the sanction that has prohibited the sale of Venezuelan oil to the US and essentially taken Venezuelan oil out of the sort of legitimate international market, and forced Venezuela to sell its oil at a steep discount in sort of to essentially refineries. They call them teapot refineries in China, like that. So I was there in Venezuela when this happened, and there's a tremendous amount of commenting and opining going on about what it all meant. And many people said to me some version of the following. One, they said, and this has to do with sanctions, and sanctions are essentially the crux of this work and the work that Francisco's been doing, which is proposing ways to use sanctions to create an oil for essentials program for Venezuela. Not to use sanctions, but within the framework of sanctions to do that. And so what the Americans have done now is they have, for a period of 6 months, essentially permitted much of the economic activity that's been frozen for the last several years. And people said, the first thing they said was, look, this proves that sanctions work, because Maduro never would have sat down, he never would have cut a deal if there were no sanctions. And then the second thing they said was, but the gringos didn't get enough for what they gave, and essentially Maduro got off easy. And that is, Woody Allen used to have this line where he was talking about a restaurant where he said the food was bad and the portions were too small. And that's essentially what this was, because it makes, you can't say that sanctions work and the gringos didn't get enough, because if sanctions work, that means they forced Maduro to hand over whatever was the desired effect of the sanctions. But the complaint is, oh, we didn't get enough. And so I have very strong views about whether those two sentences are true or make sense. I think they aren't true and don't make sense, but I would like to hear Francisco's opinion on that. First, does Barbados prove that sanctions worked in this case? And second, did the gringos not get enough?
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot. That's a great question. And thanks also for your comments on the book. I mean, to me, it's not just a question of, you know, their food being bad and there not being enough of it. I just really don't think that there's anything in this restaurant. I think that the restaurant already closed down and we haven't even realized it. I think that, I mean, let me first say something about what it means for sanctions to work, because that in itself is a concept that there's a lot to it. So when people talk about sanctions working, it implies that those sanctions help generate the objective. So in Venezuela, the objective is to lead the country towards having a free and fair election. So they contributed towards creating that objective. Now, it's also the case that sanctions have very significant collateral consequences on the lives of people, and there's a discussion as to whether those collateral effects should be accepted or not. And there are people who believe that even if sanctions work in terms of creating enough pressure for the government to change its conduct, the collateral effects are still not justified. But nevertheless, what we do know is that the effectiveness of sanctions in general, at least what the literature establishes, is somewhat limited. That there are, let's put it this way, there are many, many cases in which sanctions don't work, and those far outweigh the number of cases in which you could make the case that sanctions work. Now, in the case of Venezuela, I see absolutely no evidence that that sanctions worked in this case, for a very simple reason, which is exactly your second one. I don't think that the US got anything out of it. Now, whenever these, of course, whenever one of these events comes out, then there will be a lot of people, including a lot of people who I agree with and who favor negotiations and would like to see a negotiated solution to Venezuela, to say, well, you know, this is good, this is a positive step. And then, of course, then come on the back of that, then there are people who say, well, see, that means that sanctions actually did work. But what I think that we're seeing, that we saw both at the moment of the agreement and right now, where over the course of the past couple of days, the Supreme Court has invalidated or in their somewhat baroque language, suspended the effects of the opposition primaries, is that there is nothing that's changed in the government's conduct with respect to how to deal with the opposition and how to deal with political dissent. And even if you go back to what was signed 2 weeks ago in Barbados, and this is something that I know I've been engaged in some discussions where David has participated also, that where I've made this point previously. I like to compare the Barbados agreement with an agreement that was put forward in 2018 in negotiations that were held in the Dominican Republic between the Maduro government and the opposition at that time. There was a lengthy negotiation process. It was primarily at that moment on electoral conditions, because it was at the end of 2017, start of 2018. So elections were less than a year away. And if you actually read the 2018 agreement and you compare it with the 2023 agreement, they're not that different. But the 2018 agreement was turned down by the opposition. So in 2018, the opposition said, we're not signing this. This agreement does not bind the government. This agreement does not ensure that there will be free and fair elections. There is nothing in this agreement that commits the government to free and fair elections. So essentially what I'm saying is, Maduro showed up in 2023 with a carbon copy of the agreement that the opposition had refused to sign in 2018. And now the opposition signed it. I mean, to me, that actually means that Maduro won the political standoff. And this is actually not something that's rare in these conflict type situations. To me, it very much resembles the case, for example, of the FARC, that turned down an agreement that was proposed by Pastrana when they thought that they were powerful enough to take power, and then actually had to accept an agreement that was proposed by President Santos, which was much worse than the one that they had turned down when they thought that they would be powerful. Well, the reason that the opposition turned down the 2018 agreement, which is an agreement that also specified that there were going to be international observers in the elections, that also specified that there would be a process for opening up the registry of voters, including of voters outside of the country, that specified that the audits that would be carried out on the system would be the same exact ones as those in 2015, which was when the opposition had won the parliamentary elections. The reason that the opposition decided that it was not going to sign that is because it thought that by boycotting the elections, they could force Maduro from power. And that did not work. They tried that, and Maduro stayed in power. And now the opposition essentially has decided to go to elections, which is something that in 2018 they rolled out. And in fact, we have a person who was probably the staunchest advocate of a non-electoral solution, who is Maria Corina Machado, has been elected as the nominee of the opposition. And now, if you look at what she says about elections, it actually looks very much like what the small reduced group in which I count myself, which advocated electoral participation in 2018, said were the reasons that you had to participate in elections. Because the opposition just essentially found out that boycotting elections is something that has a limit, and if they weren't able to force Maduro from power through electoral boycotts, then they have no option but to participate in elections. So bottom line, Maduro didn't give anything. There's absolutely no concession that comes out of this agreement. And for the people that thought that there was a concession in Maduro saying, we will respect the opposition primaries, by the way, as long as they're held in consistency with the Venezuelan law and constitution. Well, what do we see this week? That Maduro says, oh, well, yes, I'm doing everything consistent with the interpretation of the Supreme Court, which, by the way, was totally appointed by Maduro. So my point is the following. I am not very optimistic that you will get an electoral solution to Venezuela's problems. I'm not even very optimistic that you will get a solution to the political problem. I think that there's a very probable scenario in which for several years and even for the foreseeable future, the current government and the current political regime stays in place. And it's not something that I like, and it's something that I would like to change. But what I'm saying is, look, there are a lot of other really important things, such as that malnutrition rate of over 30%, that we can work on trying to address. And the only problem that needs to be solved in Venezuela is not the political problem of who is in power. I agree that that's a very important problem. But the problem of Venezuelan families having enough to eat should not be treated as a subordinate problem to the problem of who is in power and who is in Miraflores Palace.
Follow up on that question of Willie's. As Francisco suggested, we've actually talked about this in other spaces. We have a somewhat different view on what was achieved, but in the end, it's actually quite similar. I mean, I actually think that something was achieved in the Barbados agreements. The Maduro government actually did agree to relinquish some of the control it had over the electoral process in several different ways. Threats that it had over the process, and it allowed, it said it's going to allow international observers, something that it also was hesitant to do. I mean, whether they fulfill that is a different issue, but I think something actually was achieved. And I would agree that I think they actually probably got less or the same or less than they would have gotten in 2018. But the thing is, as I told Francisco before, when I was 27, I used to be able to do 20 pull-ups, really no problem. Now, if I can do 2, it's like makes my day, because now I'm 57, 30 years later, it's completely different. My body has changed. The same thing with the opposition. After 5 years, the opposition is in a completely different situation. It's much weaker, And so getting what it did, I think, is actually quite remarkable. Being able to mobilize what it did, being a much weaker opposition in a much worse situation, I think is really applause worthy. Now, this comes back to the original question of Willie's about whether this is a case in which you can say, well, look, the sanctions worked. And that is indeed what people are saying. Look, the only thing that gets the regime to make a concession is that the gringos have the sanctions, But there's this sort of profound problem of, if you will, sort of endogeneity in this, in that the sanctions actually have had such an impact in structuring each of the players and their situations that it's hard to kind of distinguish it as a factor in the conflict. I mean, the sanctions basically, in my view, have really undermined the opposition since 2017, 2018. It's caused basically a migration crisis, a humanitarian emergency that's caused a migration crisis that has really, I think, undermined the opposition, putting in a much more difficult situation. It has also more recently, because of the same process, had an impact on the Biden administration. The Biden administration is suddenly much more interested in this because of the migration process. In the past month, for the first time ever, the U.S.-Mexican border, more Venezuelans crossed that border than Mexican. And so this has suddenly become a really top priority by it. That is also, I think, you can attribute to the sanctions. And so I think it's just really, really hard to think of this, that the sanctions were the only chip that worked. I think the sanctions, the Maduro government was motivated to try and get this license, this 6-month license, and get out from under the sanctions. That was their motivation, to make concessions at the table. But the sanctions themselves had such a role in creating the whole situation that they ended up sort of resolving the situation they created. And so I think it's just really, really hard to sort that out. So I have other questions and comments, but why don't we open it up?
Yep. So please, let's open for you. Over there. Can you say please your name and?
Oh, yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mason. I'm a first-year student here at DU. My question is, can you list 3 crimes against humanity that are being committed in Venezuela as of right now? That was something that was previously mentioned. Who are these crimes being committed against? Will the perpetrators be brought to justice? And is the United States at fault for any of these because of the sanctions that it previously imposed?
Okay. Well, I think that's a question that any of us could answer, and I think that David actually, somebody who has followed this a lot much more directly and exhaustively than I have. But I also think that the answer is straightforward. There's very strong evidence that there have been serious violations of human rights in Venezuela, and they have been systematic. These include torture. They also include extrajudicial killings. So these, there's no question that these have occurred, and that these have occurred a significant number of times. So when you, of course, when you qualify something as crimes against humanity, you're taking an additional step, which is, there are human rights violations occur, and these human rights violations can sometimes be frequent, but are they systematic, and are they directed against the population? And are they, and who is essentially directing them? And in this case, is it the government? So there are 2 processes right now that have investigated this issue. One of them is a fact-finding mission named by the UN Human Rights Council. And they have found in their language, it's reason to believe that crimes against humanity have occurred and that the most high-ranking members of the administration, of the Maduro administration, have been involved. And there's an investigation that has been opened also by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that has also found enough reason in the preliminary investigation to carry out a full-fledged investigation of this. Now, all of that said, there has not yet been a trial or a conviction or even an indictment from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court for these crimes against humanity. It is an ongoing investigation, and as in all matters of justice, there's an issue of due process. Even the fact-finding mission is very clear in stating that their standards of evidence are to find reason to believe that these crimes have occurred, but that's very different from actually having a court there being due process, those who are accused having the opportunity to defend themselves. We have not yet seen that process. That does not, that's in no way does that intend to deny that the crimes have occurred. It's just that the justice system works very slowly in these cases, much more so in a case like this, where the government that is in power in Venezuela is not a government that supports the investigation of these crimes. But I do think that when all is said and done, we do have evidence of, I would say, heinous and systematic human rights violations. And in fact, in Willie's book, that, I mean, there's a lot of examples, but in Willie's book there is which we'll be also talking about more tomorrow. There is an anecdote, a story of a Venezuelan human rights lawyer, Jose Centearo, and how he was kidnapped, he was tortured, he was kind of taken to a beach and essentially threatened that he was going to be shot. The story in itself is harrowing, but this it's very clear that this has happened numerous times in Venezuela, and it's happened under the Maduro government. Oh, well, is the U.S. at fault for this? That is actually, I think, a very complex question to answer, because it involves, and it's definitely, at least I view myself as not very competent to answer it, because it has to do with how you establish responsibility and moral responsibility, and particularly indirect moral responsibility. So let me put it this way. There are a number of academic papers, including papers that look at the international, cross-national evidence, that find that human rights violations actually increase after sanctions, and that claim that there's a causal effect, that sanctions lead to higher rates of human rights violations, so that governments that are authoritarian become even more repressive after sanctions are imposed. Now, let's suppose that result is correct. As anything in the analysis of cross-country data, there are different interpretations, and it's contestable. Let's take as a given that result is correct, and that there is a causal effect between imposing sanctions and the government that has control of the territory becoming more repressive. Can you jump from that to saying there is a moral responsibility of those who impose the sanctions in that they contributed to these human rights violations occurring, even though they're not the ones who are committing the crimes? It's actually the Maduro government. I would not make that argument. I know that some people would. Some people would say yes. I mean, if the U.S. knew that as a result of its sanctions, then the targeted regime was going to become more repressive, then it has a moral responsibility. I wouldn't make it, because I think that you can come up with many examples that are very similar where that does not make sense, where that type of reasoning does not make sense. I mean, do you think that if a judge condemns a criminal to a life sentence, and as a result of that, somebody in that person's family takes their lives, is the judge morally responsible for that, or is the person who committed the crime? I mean, these are variations actually of something that my students and I spend a lot of time discussing, and have discussed also with David, which is that famous trolley problem. I mean, they're very complex and moral issues and moral decisions. But what I do think is important about this is that so you can talk about the effect on repression and on crimes against humanity, but there's a much more direct effect of sanctions, which is also much more decisively established, which is that sanctions lead to very significant deteriorations in living conditions in target countries. We have very strong evidence of this. We have some of the empirical estimates point to the effects of sanctions being as significant, if not more, than those of armed conflict in terms of the deterioration in the economy, in terms of the increase, the deterioration in health conditions, increase in mortality. So given that evidence that we have, when a country like the US imposes economic sanctions on Venezuela, and something that I'd really like to point out, which is something that I think bears repeating a lot, but is very often lost. The United States is the only country that has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela. Neither Europe, Canada, Japan, any other Latin American countries, they've imposed personal sanctions on regime officials. Europe has been very clear about this from the start. They were not going to do anything that contributed to worsening Venezuela's economic or humanitarian crisis. Now, can we, in that case, make the argument that there's a responsibility of the U.S. for having contributed to the country's economic and humanitarian crisis? Well, here again, I would say there's definitely a causal effect. I'm much more convinced of the causal effect here. I still think that the question of moral responsibility is a very complex question, and it's essentially a question that even very good moral philosophers have trouble in grappling with. However, what I do think we can contribute to is that these effects are well known of and discussed at the moment at which the sanctions are imposed, and that given that these effects are well identified, if the United States government is going to make the argument that the deaths and the hunger that are caused by these sanctions are not their moral responsibility, let them at least acknowledge that these effects exist, which is what all of the literature and all of the studies tell you. Talking about US officials about this is extremely frustrating because you speak with high-ranking US officials, and when you bring up sanctions, they turn into a version of the Twitterzuela that David was talking about, and they'll say, "Oh, I refuse to accept the premise that sanctions have anything to do with Venezuela's crisis. The responsibility for that crisis lies squarely on Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Chavez." And it's like, why is a well-trained US State Department official responding with an argument that I would not accept from one of my students?
Could I just add a couple of things on that, this ICC? There actually is, there's in the ICC, there is what's called Venezuela 1, and that is the case that everyone's heard about, and it includes the crimes against humanity that Francisco mentioned. That one important element of this is that, a big part of the case is the sort of repression of protests, torturing of protesters and dissidents, and then, in many cases, the death in the course of repression of protests. But another really big part of this is actually police operations in poor working class neighborhoods, in which from 2015 2020 killed thousands of people. In some years it was up to 5,000. These would be police operations that they would take. These units that were part police, part military, go into these neighborhoods and shoot them all up. They'd kill 25, 30 people and say, "We killed 25 delinquents. We killed 30 delinquents," and without any kind of evidentiary basis that they were actually delinquents. And so that is also a big part of the case. And that's one of the things that makes it a little bit more interesting because that goes beyond the sort of government opposition divide, because this was a case, this was something you can sort of think of as sort of necropopulism or a necro spectacle, that the spectacle of death, the spectacle of showing state power, through violence, something that has happened in any number of countries. And so that is part of the case that is called Venezuela 1, that makes it a little bit more cross-cutting than you might think. It's called Venezuela 1 because there's actually Venezuela 2, which is a case. It's actually still at the referral stage. No, Venezuela 1 is actually at the investigative stage, which is about the third stage. This Venezuela 2 was actually referred by the Maduro government against the United States because of its sanctions and the humanitarian costs for it. But it's still at the referral stage. They have not actually opened investigations. There's a whole preliminary review of the evidence to decide whether the case is taken up, and that's where it is now. And so one other comment about the ICC cases that I think is quite interesting. These cases take a long time. I mean, there's not going to be any kind of trials or arrests anytime soon. And that is both because of the complexity of international law, and the idea of an international body, accusing and trying somebody from a particular country, but it's also by design because the ICC is an institution that functions on the principle of complementarity. It functions when national law and institutions of justice don't function, and so that complementarity is not something that just calls the ICC. You can turn that around and it creates something that's called positive complementarity. So the ICC will actually go to a country and say, okay, we are acting here because your justice system is not working. No, what you need to do with your justice system is this, this, and this. And so the ICC actually has an office in Caracas that it can advise. And so the idea is that this can motivate improvements in the justice system, and so this is something that could be a positive impact. So far, we can't say that there's been a really good impact. We can say that, for example, these police operations have really diminished once this case in the ICC developed. As far as like actual trials of people and getting to the levels of higher command, that really hasn't happened. No, but it's a long process. And it's trial and error, I think, on the Maduro government's part as well. They try to sort of promote the image that they've made changes to the justice system, and then people say, well, no, not actually. And the ICC is, well, we don't believe this. You need to do this, this, and this. But it's a process that extends through time that has great potential to sort of motivate and generate changes in the justice system that could make an agreement more likely in the future.
I just want to point out that the operations that David was talking about during a period of time were called the Operation Liberation of the People.
So since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going just to recover all the questions you have and they can reply. So there's a mic over there someplace.
I was going to ask a question.
You have, okay, I'm going to just take everything so they can reply.
So quickly, first of all, felicitaciones, Francisco. Really excited to learn about this in your work, and I hope people are, the other stakeholders are paying attention to what you were saying, because it really seems like an interesting project. On that note, what is the role that something similar to what was done in, I don't know if it was success or not, apparently there's some disagreement there, but in 2003, 2004, I mean, the Grupo de Amigos de Venezuela, something along those lines, which means like, what role could actors in the region, such as, the role Lula now back in power could create that kind of cooperation from countries interested in improving the situation too, eventually for a political transition. But in the meantime, you mentioned about the malnutrition and the family support. Something like Bolsa Familia could be emulated in Venezuela, because it seems to be like a very, very successful project. In the case of Brazil, that could maybe be shared. So something I'm talking about cooperation that could be more institutionalized, such as that, in a political process, but also on this more applied programs. So if there's any role and in space for that kind of articulation.
All right. Thank you so much. It's actually wonderful to hear about Venezuela. and the roadmap for negotiations, which is quite interesting. Actually, my question comes to the principle of coexistence. Though I came late, but I had you mentioned something about coexistence and possibly the negotiations that actually happened in South Africa as well as in Zimbabwe. I want to know if there is a kind of like measurement, either qualitative or quantitative measurement of coexistence, because particularly if we are to check the point in Zimbabwe, of course, there was the principle of coexistence, but at the end of the day, the coexistence was imbalanced because though the government negotiated, incoming government of Robert Mugabe, mostly the Black people kept suppressed. The regime actually, which has been ruling for quite a long time, just transferred wealthy to the minority whites. And that was the situation for for 2 decades until 2000, when he actually decided to have a land reform program, which in 2001, America decided to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe because of violation of human rights and elections that were held in 2000. But prior to 2000, we had also issues of violation of human rights in Zimbabwe with the government. We had also issues of election rigging by the Robert Mugabe government. Why is it the sanctions were imposed in 2001 after Mugabe engaged in the land reform program, than prior to that when he was actually being seen as a good man to the Western world, as well as Nelson Mandela. If we go to South Africa right now, every citizen in South Africa, Black particularly, saying that Nelson Mandela betrayed us because of the negotiation he did. He only transferred in terms of political freedom, but in terms of economic freedom and resources, until today, it is in the hands of the white minority. So I want to understand what is the qualitative or the quantitative measure of coexistence, because I'm in question with that, and how can it actually necessitate or help us to come into negotiations in particularly developing countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa.
Thank you. Somebody else has a question? Here.
You mentioned that Venezuela's economy is driven by oil exports. I was just wondering, how does sustainable energy kind of moving forward affect their economy? Just in general. Thanks.
Anybody else?
I just wanted to ask, in 6 months, we'll be right in the middle of a US presidential election. Is that going to gum up anything positive that might come out of the current moment as far as, you know, reasonably dealing with the sanctions and talking about Venezuela in a educated, balanced way?
Yeah, no, I wrote them down. I wrote them all down. So okay, so let me start on the group of friends for Venezuela. There is in effect something similar. So the negotiations are supported by countries and the countries that, I mean, essentially what's happened is that the sides have agreed that there will be countries that are more friendly to one or the other of the sides, and they will form part of the infrastructure support. It's not clear that they're playing a huge role right now, although of course there is a mediation or facilitation process, which is hosted right now by Barbados, up until recently by Mexico, and there's the participation of the Kingdom of Norway. So definitely there's a role for international help in getting the two sides together. Now, is there a space for more direct assistance from groups in the region and from other countries, particularly in terms of implementing policies? I think that it would be great if there were. In fact, in 2016, when I had left Bank of America and before I joined another institution in which I worked, I actually worked for a couple of months with UNASUR, which is the regional organization that tried to get the Venezuelan government, or try to provide some advice to the Venezuelan government in terms of redesigning its economic and its social policies. We wrote a report. That report was presented to the Venezuelan government. It was also part of the broader process of negotiations. A lot of the report was ignored by the Maduro government, regrettably. But there is something that happened at that time, which I do think was quite important, which was the shift from, and this was part of our recommendations, the shift from a program of highly inefficient, distortionary, indirect subsidies through prices and exchange controls to a system of direct distribution of food packages, which is the CLAP system. And for all of the problems that the CLAP system has, it's definitely a lot better than what was there before, because up until 2016, essentially the government was spending huge amounts of money in subsidizing the exchange rate so that these large supermarkets would have access, including many of them publicly run supermarkets, would have access to very cheap products, and the idea that they were going to be able to sell these products to Venezuelans, and particularly to low-income Venezuelans. And in reality, many of those products just ended up in Colombia, or they ended up being resold at black market prices. So shifting to a system of direct distribution, I mean, despite the problems that the system has, is one of the recommendations that was put forward in the UNASUR report, and which I do think led to an improvement relative to what there was before in Venezuelan food policies. So no, I think that it would be great if other governments can come in, and that's why part of the emphasis that we put in the report is in this idea of redesigning social policies. And this is one of the questions that the international community should be asking. So how do we take what is currently being done by the government in terms of attending to a humanitarian crisis and help improve that, help that be strengthened by participation of other groups outside of the government, by local participation, that the use of those resources be monitored so that they effectively attend to people's needs. That's part of where we want to focus the discussion. On the issue of coexistence, so I think it was Albert Hirschman who said that in relation to development, that economic development is like a giraffe. It's very difficult to define, but you know when you see one. Well, I think that with coexistence, you could say the same thing. I actually don't know if there are quantitative attempts at measuring it. It is, of course, something very difficult, among things, for precisely because of what you pointed out, which is that and South Africa can look at it like a successful case, but there are definitely grievances, and those grievances are from sectors of the population that believe that whole process consolidated and solidified existing inequalities. So it very much depends on the interpretation that you put on the existence of those inequalities, and on whether that agreement and even the coexistence that comes out of it is even a good thing. So, and I'm sure that if we do get an agreement, in the same way in which there are people who do not believe that in Poland there should have been a national unity government and that solidarity should have sat down with the military regime, much less try to run the country. You're going to get that type of objections in any negotiated transition. And if we have one in Venezuela, I am sure that we will see those objections. Now, the fact that the objections exist, you at least as an economist, I'd like to think in terms of counterfactual. So my question is, what is the counterfactual to South Africa? What would have happened if you had not had that process? And to me, the counterfactual to South Africa right now looks a lot like Zimbabwe, and I think that there we can agree that is not an improvement over South Africa's current situation, with all of the problems that transition might have had. The sustainable energy. So, I mean, I don't like saying this, and I kind of regret having to say this, but this is for most Venezuelans, this is a non-issue. If you come to talk to them about sustainable energy, many, I don't think this is true of all, but many people will essentially look at you as if you just landed off of Mars. And it's understandable. This is an economy that has gone through a huge crisis where the material conditions, living conditions of people have deteriorated to levels that they would have deemed unthinkable. If you come to them and say, and it's a country that its main source of wealth is oil. So if you come to this country right now and tell them, hey, you know what, you shouldn't be selling that oil. You should just like leave it there because it's going to harm the rest of the planet. I think that they will understandably say, well, why in the world are you picking on us to solve the problems of the planet? I mean, to the country that has suffered the deepest deterioration in living standards that has occurred outside of wartime, I mean, go pick on somebody else. That I think will be the reaction of many Venezuelans. But I do think that it's an issue that has to be taken seriously by any Venezuelan government. I mean, if you think that you're going to develop the Venezuelan economy on the same model of selling fossil fuels to the rest of the world that was prevalent at a moment at which there was no concern with the harm that those fossil fuels were creating to the environment, then you're living in another world, and that is part of kind of a pervasive problem of Venezuela, which is that when you hear the sides to this conflict talk about just like about anything, it almost sounds as like you're hearing people talk about conflicts that and with modes of thinking that were prevalent kind of 100 years ago. And that's much, if you hear the government talk and it sounds like they're like reading these badly translated manuals of how to run a centrally planned communist economy. And you look at a lot of the opposition talk and it looks pretty much like what a discussion of a conservative oligarchic 19th century political party would have looked like. So that is a problem. We have to find a way to think not just about the present, but about the future. And we're still very much trapped by the problems and the ways of thinking about these problems of the past. And the issue on the, is the US presidential election going to contribute towards a recent debate on foreign policy? I would say it doesn't look that way, but I might be wrong. But now what is true is that the US US politics in many dimensions, including that of foreign policy, seems to be becoming much less predictable. And one of the things is that I really I think that for me it is hard to imagine a government that would have carried out a worse and most counterproductive foreign policy towards Venezuela than the Trump administration. But I can also say that I have no idea right now of whether a second Trump administration would be anything like. It might end up being just the opposite for all we know of what a first Trump administration was like. So we just don't know. There are huge levels of uncertainty as to how they think about a lot of foreign policy problems. I think on the side of the Democrats, it's sort of clearer, but there's still huge levels of uncertainty. And this gets us back to some of these issues that were being raised in terms of the negotiation. Is what's happening now really a concession that the US government, when it lifted sanctions made to the Maduro regime, because the Maduro regime is actually giving some concessions on the electoral space? To me, and I might be wrong, this is open to interpretation, to me, it looks more like the US just basically wanted to lift sanctions on Venezuela and was looking for a way of doing it, a way of presenting it. And they know that one way of doing it, which will generate the least resistance in places that where they don't want this resistance to veer them off track, is by saying, well, yes, we're doing this to support the negotiations process. And I can tell you that I've spoken to negotiators on the opposition side who basically have told me, look, yeah, this is something that the US wanted to do. And so this is not something that, it's not that we reached an agreement in the US that it was going to support it. It was more the other way around, that the US wanted to reach a deal to lift sanctions on Venezuela. And since the opposition is so dependent on the US, the opposition really had no choice but to go along with it. So I do think that in the Biden administration, we're seeing a different type of thinking, but that type of thinking is not even a thinking. I don't like the policies that were imposed by Trump, and I don't like the fact that that Biden maintained them. And I think that lifting sanctions in Venezuela or significantly easing them is a lot better than what we had before. But I also think that this decision is really not about Venezuelans. This is a decision that's being taken by the Biden administration because it wants to increase the supply of oil to U.S. markets, and because it wants to find a way to address the migration crisis in which Venezuelans play a very significant role. And that, I think, is one of the very negative consequences of all of this process, which is that things that are very important for Venezuelans are being decided not just outside of Venezuela, but they're being decided with very little input from Venezuelans.
Well,
Well, I can talk to that last thing a little bit because I've done a lot of reporting in Washington on that issue, and it's essentially as you said. I mean, the reason that this deal in Barbados happened now is because a window existed to get things done before the presidential election season got started, and there isn't a lot of expectation that much will happen once that begins. But essentially, the Biden administration decided that what it wanted was an economically stable Venezuela in order to address the migration issue and try to ameliorate the huge number of Venezuelans coming here. And at the same time, it wanted to see Venezuelan oil return to world markets because of the war in Ukraine. And more recently, obviously, there's added pressure because of the Middle East. That is, so I mean, going back to this whole question of did the US take away sanctions without getting enough in return, it got exactly what it wanted, which was to lift the sanctions.
Okay, so
Could I-
thank you. You have
Yeah,
okay.
just two really brief comments. And this is, I'm going to sort of unfairly ask Francisco to be fairer to himself, because there's a couple of things that I think in this, Francisco's been working on this for a long time, and there's been multiple sort of products of this as well as sort of continuing advocacy. And so back to the first sort of exchange, the 2021 Memorandum of Understanding, one of the things that distinguishes that from the 2019 process is precisely that issue, is that they built into it is the idea of partial agreements. That was part of it right from the very beginning. And it was part of that right from the very beginning because you and other people have been advocating for that for several years. And so you in particular, and Fordo Civico and others have been advocating around that. And I think that was something that was actually taken up in part because of that advocacy. And then just this last, the events of this past month, the US indeed wants to get, the Biden administration inherited this policy and they stuck with it for quite a while. They indeed want to get out from under sanctions, in part because of the migration process, or I guess these are all kind of related. But I think it's very clear, if you look at the statements of Juan Gonzalez, he doesn't just say, oh, we're doing this, he could have just said, oh, we're doing this to get the Maduro government to return to democracy. No, he said, we want to do this because they're not having an impact and they're causing humanitarian emergency and a migration crisis, which is exactly the arguments that you've been making for a number of years. So.
Thank you very much for being with us today and reminding yourself that you can have yourself here with a copy of the book. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invite, Francisco, as well.